Montana Territory. Late spring of 1877, the wind was sharp on the edge of the Bitterroots, and the girl in the threadbare blue dress stood like a post in the middle of the road, watching her father shake hands with a drifter who had dead eyes. Elira Langley was 19 and silent. Her hands, red from dishwater and sun, hung at her sides. Her mother wouldn't look at her, just kept wringing her apron with tight fingers. Her father's voice was low, but Elira heard the clink of coins, 2 silver eagles, maybe 3, and then the words, "She's your problem now." The drifter barely nodded. He was thin under his duster, unshaven, and his eyes were hollow like river stones, flat and cold. He grabbed her wrist too hard, and Elira flinched but didn't cry out. Crying had never helped. They walked. No horse, no cart. The man said nothing, just dragged her along the dirt road, heading west. Her feet bled before the sun fell. He didn't stop. By the time they reached the edge of a pine brake, Elira stumbled and collapsed. He kicked her once in the ribs. "Walk," she curled around the pain. "Please." He reached for his belt. That was when the hoofbeats came hard and fast, cutting through the hush of the trees. A single rider. The drifter turned, hand on his gun, but the man on the horse was faster. His rifle was already up. "Let her go," the cowboy said, voice steady. The drifter's lip curled. "She's mine, paid for." The cowboy dismounted in one swift motion, rifle still trained on the drifter. He wore a dark coat, dusty from riding, and his boots were worn through at the heels. His face was sun-lined, his jaw unshaven, but his eyes, they were sharp as broken glass and burning. "I'll pay you twice what you gave." The cowboy's voice was quiet, but it hit like thunder. "And you'll walk away." The drifter's hand hovered on his pistol. "She ain't worth that." The cowboy stepped closer. "Then you won't mind the trade." A long pause, then the drifter spit in the dirt and backed off. "Fine." The cowboy took a leather pouch from his saddlebag, tossed it at the man's feet. The drifter scooped it up, counted quick, and disappeared into the trees without another word. Elira lay on the ground, shaking. The cowboy knelt beside her, gentle now. "Can you sit up?" She nodded, barely. He pulled off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Name's Hollis Carrigan." She didn't answer right away. Her face was pale, lips cracked. "I'm not taking you anywhere you don't want to go," Hollis said quietly. "You're safe now." Something in his voice, not soft but sure, made her eyes sting. "Elira," she whispered. "Langley," he gave her a nod. "All right, Elira, let's get you off this road." He lifted her slowly, careful not to startle her. She was all angles and bruises, too light in his arms. He set her on his horse, then climbed up behind her, keeping one arm steady around her waist as they rode. They didn't speak on the way back. The mountains faded behind them. Hollis led the horse to a small cabin tucked near a low creek, a mile off the main trail. It was rough-built but clean, with a stone chimney and a roof that held. He helped her down, hands firm but never rough. Inside, he lit the lamp and set water to boil. "You can sleep in the bed, I'll take the floor." Elira stood in the doorway like a ghost. "Why did you do that?" Hollis didn't look up. "I saw what he was. I couldn't let him take you. But you paid." "I paid to make sure he never touches you again." The words sat heavy in the air. Elira moved slow, like her limbs didn't believe in rest. She sat on the edge of the bed, eyes flicking to the door, to the window, to Hollis. "I won't lock you in." Hollis poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table. "Clean up, sleep, you're safe here." She watched him roll out a blanket near the fireplace. He didn't look at her again. That night, Elira lay awake on the straw mattress, listening to the crackle of the fire and the even rhythm of Hollis's breath. She didn't know what to make of him. He hadn't asked her anything. Hadn't touched her, not even when he had the chance. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her body stopped bracing for pain. The next morning, she found him outside, splitting wood. His sleeves were rolled up, hands calloused, movements sure. He glanced over as she stepped into the sunlight. "Mornin'," he said, wiping sweat from his temples. She nodded. "Thank you for everything." Hollis set down the axe. "You got somewhere to go," she shook her head. "There's nothing for me back there. You can stay. As long as you like." And just like that, he turned back to the woodpile. No questions, no pressure, just space. Elira stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at her hair. Later, she helped with the chores. She washed clothes by the creek, hung them in the sun. She found the henhouse, scattered with half-wild chickens and gathered eggs. At supper she sat across from him and ate stew without speaking, but after, as the fire dimmed, she looked up. "You really would have shot him, wouldn't you?" Hollis didn't blink. Without hesitation. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed. "Because I know what it's like to be used up and thrown away, and I ain't letting that happen to anyone else, not if I can stop it." Elira's throat tightened. That night she did not cry. She just sat near the fire while Hollis polished his rifle, and something in the silence between them felt solid. Like a beginning, she was not in love with him, not yet, but she felt safe, and that was more than she had ever known. The next 3 days passed with the hush of early thaw, slow, careful, and thick with things unsaid. The creek behind the cabin ran heavy with meltwater, and snow lingered in the hollows under the firs, though the sun held longer now on the tops of the grass. Elira moved quietly through each morning, sleeves rolled above her elbows, hair tied back with a strip torn from the hem of her dress. She never asked to help, but her hands found work scrubbing the stovetop with ashes, shaking dust from the old quilts, sweeping out corners where spider webs curled like smoke. Hollis didn't watch her, but he noticed. He came in one evening to find the door hinges oiled and the tin cups lined neat along the shelf. He said nothing, just nodded once and set down the bundle of kindling he'd brought in from the woods. That night, as the fire burned low, she asked, "How long have you lived out here?" He didn't look over. "5 winters, close enough. You ever go into town when I need to, not more than twice a season. You don't get lonely." His jaw shifted, but he didn't answer right away. Then, got used to the silence, started to feel more like company than people ever did. Elira pulled her knees up on the chair, arms wrapped tight around them. "I never learned how to be alone." Hollis turned then, one elbow resting on his knee. "You learn. Quiet don't ask nothin' from you." She stared into the fire. "Sometimes it does." In the days that followed, she began to walk the property when the sun rose, not far, just down to the edge of the creek and back, but it helped. Her body still ached in places she didn't speak of, but the breath came easier beneath the trees. She listened to the high whistle of jays and the drumming of woodpeckers on the dead pines. Once, she saw a fox dash across the trail, its coat the color of rust. One morning she found Hollis crouched near the trapline, examining a sprung snare with a frown. "Elk passed through last night," he said as she came up beside him. "Snapped the line, might have taken some bait." He shook his head, then stood. "You ever hunt?" She blinked. "No," he handed her a length of twine. "Tie this off there, just like I did." Her fingers hesitated, then moved to mimic his knot. She got it wrong the first time, but he said nothing, only watched. The second time held. "Good," he said simply, and turned back toward the cabin. That evening, she pulled out the mending basket and stitched a tear along the hem of his work shirt. He walked in halfway through and paused, eyes catching the thread in her hand. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied. But it needed doing. He sat across the table from her, the lamplight soft on his face. "You were raised on a farm, not much of one. What your folks grow, disappointment mostly." The words came out sharper than she meant, and she looked up quick, uncertain how he'd take it. But Hollis didn't laugh or soften. He just nodded once, like he understood something without needing it explained. That night, she didn't go to bed right away. She stayed by the fire after he stretched out on the floor, her hands folded in her lap. After a long time, she said, "I didn't think anyone stopped for me, not even God." He didn't open his eyes. "I ain't him. I don't care." The next morning, the air turned cold again and frost crept back across the windows. Elira went out with the bucket, boots crunching in the grass. When she came back in, cheeks red from the wind, she found a folded bundle on the table, 2 flannel skirts, a cotton blouse, and a wool shawl, all worn but clean. She touched the fabric with her fingers. "They belonged to my sister," Hollis said from the doorway. Before she passed, Elira looked at him. "You kept them?" She was good. Figured someone might need her kindness after she was gone. Elira pressed the shawl to her chest. "I will." Later that day, she walked into the woods without telling him. Just past the creek, she found a flat stone and sat beneath a spruce, skirt wrapped around her legs. The wind sang through the branches above, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a thing someone had traded or claimed. She sat there until the light began to tilt gold, then rose and made her way back. When she opened the door, Hollis looked up from where he was oiling the hinges of the cabin window. "I was about to come look," he said, not sharply, just quiet. "I know," she said, "but I needed to go." "Just for a while," he nodded, eyes steady on hers. "So long as you come back." "I did," she said, and meant more than just her return from the trees. He didn't press, didn't ask what she'd thought about out there under the spruce. But that night, as he handed her a tin plate of beans and cornbread, his hand brushed hers, and neither of them pulled away. On the fourth morning, Elira stood before the root cellar with a basket on one hip, sunlight brushing her shoulders. She'd rolled her sleeves down against the breeze, which had changed less bite, more promise, and she could smell wet earth beneath the pine needles. Somewhere in the trees, a raven called once and fell quiet. She didn't hear Hollis approach until his boots ground soft against the leaves behind her. "There's a neighbor up the ridge," he said. "Name's Alton Webb, keeps bees and a few goats. I trade with him now and then." Elira turned slightly. "You need me to carry something?" He glanced at her basket, then shook his head. "No, thought you might want to come." She hesitated. "Will he ask questions?" "Not if I don't answer." The ride took them past the narrow ridge trail, then down through a stand of twisted aspens. Elira rode behind him again, not because she had to, but because the saddle still wore wrong against her hips. She held the pommel with one hand and let the other rest against the back of his coat. His warmth cut the cold. They reached Alton Webb's homestead near midday. The goats bleated low from their pen, and hives sat in neat rows near the edge of a field, each topped with a flat stone to keep the lids from blowing loose. Smoke drifted from a chimney, and an old man stepped out wiping his hands on his trousers. "Carrigan," he called. "Wasn't expectin' you till next month. Ran low on honey sooner than I figured." Alton's eyes flicked to Elira. "You bring in your own company now. She's helpin' me through the spring," Hollis said evenly. Elira kept her chin level. Alton tipped his head, said nothing more. They traded on the porch 2 sacks of barley meal for a jar of beeswax, a folded cloth bag of dried apples for a bottle of vinegar. Elira stood back, watching the quiet way Hollis moved, how he never rushed his words or his hands. Once he glanced her way just long enough to check if she was all right. She nodded. On the ride back, she spoke first. "You always trade with him, when the weather allows. He didn't seem surprised to see a woman with you. I don't give folks room to dig." She ran her fingers along the saddle's stitching. "And if they do, I don't answer questions that aren't theirs to ask." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it felt less like distance and more like trust. That evening, after stew and cornbread, she found an old tin box on a low shelf behind the stove. Inside were short stubs of beeswax candles, a crooked wooden thimble, and a bundle of letters tied with blue string. She didn't open them. She just touched the string with one finger. Hollis came in from the shed and saw her crouched there. "Those belong to my sister," he said. "She wrote to friends back east, never sent most of them." Elira looked up. "You ever read them?" He shook his head. "Didn't feel right. She must have trusted you, leaving them here." "She believed in beginnings," he said, "even when the world didn't." Elira returned the box to its place. "What was her name?" "Me." Later, as the firelight sank lower, Elira stood by the window, watching the trees shift against the stars. Hollis sat at the table, tracing the edge of his cup with a calloused thumb. "You planning to leave once the thaw's full?" he asked. She turned. "You want me to?" "No." She stepped away from the window. "I don't want to go." He didn't rise, didn't reach for her. He just looked up, steady. "You've got your own mind," he said. "I won't hold you." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." It wasn't a declaration. It didn't need to be. They just sat together in the fire's hush, and the air between them felt like something planted deep and growing roots. The first rain came in the middle of the night, a soft, steady tapping on the roof, like fingertips on tin. Elira woke to it, eyes wide in the dark, heart quiet. She didn't rise, only listened, the sound unfamiliar but not frightening. Across the room, Hollis shifted in his bedroll, the low rustle of blankets the only sign he was awake too. By morning, the creek had swollen, its edges lapping closer to the tree line. Elira pulled on Me's shawl and stepped outside. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with the smell of wet bark and turned soil. She followed the narrow path behind the cabin to the sloping rise where early violets had started to push through the thawed earth. She bent to touch one, its petals trembling from the chill. Later, as they sat across from each other at the table, Hollis broke a piece of hardtack and passed her half. His knuckles were scraped, and one sleeve bore a smear of pitch. "You hurt yourself?" she asked, nodding toward his hand, snagged it on the shed door. Hinge gave way. "Want me to look at it?" He hesitated, then held it out. She took his hand gently, turning it in hers. The skin was raw along the ridge of his thumb, and dirt had worked itself into the cut. "You should have cleaned it," she said. "Didn't notice." His voice was rougher than usual, but not unkind. "I'll boil water," she said, setting his hand down carefully. He didn't stop her. That evening, she brought in a small bundle of sweetgrass she'd found growing near the low bank. She didn't know what she meant to do with it, only that her fingers wanted to carry something soft into the house. She laid it on the windowsill, where it could dry in the last of the light. Hollis was carving something near the stove, a length of pine in his lap. He didn't look up as she came in, but his voice was easy. "You ever learn to shoot?" "No," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "My father said it wasn't a woman's place." He set down the carving knife. "You want to?" She sat down across from him, legs tucked beneath the chair. "Are you offering to teach me, if you've got the want for it?" "I think I do." He gave a short nod. "We'll start at first light, no sense putting it off." The next morning, he handed her his old rifle. It was heavier than she expected, the wood worn smooth where his hands had rested. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the butt against her shoulder, how to breathe just before the trigger gave. They aimed at a knot in a fence post, and her first shot kicked her back a step. She didn't hit the mark. "Again," he said. By the fifth try, she grazed the edge. He smiled, not wide, but enough. "You'll be better than me in a month." She lowered the rifle and looked at him. "You think I'll still be here in a month? I hope you will." That night, they didn't light the lamp. They sat beside the fire, the glow painting soft lines across the walls. Elira worked a patch of mending along one of the chair cushions, her needles slipping in and out of the fabric. Hollis leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, watching the flames. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, without looking up. "I did once. Thought I'd head east toward the Missouri, maybe further." "What stopped you?" He was quiet a long time, then, "Too much still holding me here. Memory sticks to land more than people think." She tied off the thread and set the cushion aside. "I never had land to belong to. You do now, if you want it." She looked at him then, not startled, not uncertain, just steady. "I think I do." They didn't speak after that. She stood and crossed the room, and he rose as she reached him. No words, no rush. Just her hand reaching for his, and his fingers wrapping around hers like it was always meant to be that way. When they kissed, it was slow. Not hesitant, but built from trust not taken, not demanded. The fire cracked behind them, and the rain had come again, soft against the roof. Elira rested her forehead against his chest, and Hollis didn't move to lead or press. He just held her there, his arms strong around her, and the silence between them was full. The first time Elira baked bread in the cabin, the smell filled every beam and corner, warm and full, like something unspoken made real. She used the last of the lard and shaped the dough with careful hands, sleeves rolled back to the elbows. Hollis had brought in fresh ground flour from the bottom sack, and she'd found a small crock of dried rosemary must have tucked away seasons ago. She crushed it between her palms as she worked, scent rising like memory. When she pulled the loaf from the oven and set it on the table, Hollis leaned in, his brow lifted. "That smells like it ought to cost something." "It does," she said. "You'll be splitting wood twice as long tomorrow." He cut into the crust once it cooled, said nothing at first, just chewed slow. "Then, I'll split till my hands give out if it means more of this." "No need for dramatics," she said, but her face softened. That night, they shared the bread with goat cheese from Alton's trade. Hollis refilled her cup before his own and didn't speak much, but something in the way his eyes held hers said more than any toast could have. After they cleared the table, Elira opened one of the trunks had left behind, the hinges stiff from disuse. Beneath a folded wool blanket lay a narrow wooden box. Inside rested a delicate hand mirror, its silver backing dulled but uncracked, and a comb carved from horn. She ran her fingers along the teeth, then glanced over. "Do you remember what me looked like?" "Not the way she'd want me to," Hollis said, "but I remember how she smelled like soap and pine resin, and that she hummed when she peeled apples." Elira nodded, then closed the lid. "She left pieces of herself all through this place. She'd be glad you found them." The days stretched longer. They planted potatoes in the softening ground behind the cabin, working side by side. Hollis dug rows with a spade while Elira dropped eyes into the earth, covering them with the heel of her palm. She wiped her brow with the edge of her sleeve and glanced up. "You ever have a garden before?" "No," he said, "but I watched enough to see what not to do." "Then we're both guessing." He handed her a canteen and she drank. "Feels good to guess with someone." Later, she brought in sprigs of new mint and set them in a cup by the window. They brewed it into tea that night, the scent sharp and clean. As the weeks passed, she began using his name more often. Not just when she needed something, but in quiet moments. When she wanted him to know she was still listening, still there. One evening, as the wind died and the stars came out in full, she sat on the cabin step with her knees drawn up, watching the last of the smoke curl from the chimney. "I thought once," she said, "that if I ever got free, I'd run all the way to the sea. Just keep walking till the land gave out." Hollis leaned against the doorway behind her. "What stopped you?" "I didn't want to be alone when I got there." He came and sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "You aren't alone now." She looked at him, and the quiet between them shifted, fuller than before. "I know," she said, "and I don't want to be anywhere else." He reached for her hand, slow and certain. She let her fingers thread through his, palm to palm. That spring, they built a second coop for the hens and patched the roof before the summer storms could find its weakness. Elira started keeping a small bundle of pressed leaves and petals in the drawer by her bed, each one labeled in her careful hand. She wrote their names on scraps of parchment: Violet, Yarrow, Spruce Tip. Hollis carved a shelf for her books, and when he finished, she kissed the back of his neck while he was still brushing off the sawdust. He stilled, then turned, and the way he kissed her back had no hesitation at all. They talked of marriage one evening over cider, plain words, no ceremony, just a promise spoken between two people who had already begun their life together. "I don't need a preacher," she said. "Just need to know you'll stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "And you don't need to ask again." That summer, they dug out a second plot for vegetables, beans, and squash and started walking to Alton Webb's every fortnight, not for trade only, but for company. Webb had grown softer toward Elira and once brought her a tin of honeycomb wrapped in cloth. "You've settled him some," he said, nodding toward Hollis. "Didn't think anyone could." Elira just smiled and tucked the tin under her arm. By the end of the season, she no longer started awake at every noise in the night. Her body had softened with rest and strength both. She wore her hair loose more often, and Hollis had built a small bench under the window where she sat to read or mend. One evening, as the air turned golden and the first geese flew low over the trees, Elira came in with a woven basket of late summer berries, her fingers stained purple, her cheeks warm from the sun. "I think this is the first place I've ever belonged," she said as she set the basket down. Hollis crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You belong here," he said. "With me." She turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and sure, like the way they'd come to trust the seasons. Like the way the earth gave back what was planted, if tended right. That winter, they married under the spruce tree where Elira had once sat alone. Alton Webb stood witness, and Mee's shawl wrapped around Elira's shoulders. Hollis held her hands steady as they spoke their vows, low and simple, with no need for more than what already stood between them. They lived quiet and long, through every thaw and harvest that followed. Their names were carved side by side into the inside beam of the cabin, not because they needed to be remembered, but because the life they built asked to be known. And in the stillness of each evening, with the fire casting light on the walls and the wind soft beyond the door, they held each other close and knew without question, without end, that they were home.